investment in the development of infrastructures to open investment opportunities, enhance economic productivity, promote economic growth, and improve the quality of life of our people.
Africa is no longer waiting for permission. For decades, the world mined her land, carried away her wealth, and left only dust behind. But today, a new chapter is being written. From Harare to Windhoek, leaders are standing tall. Zimbabwe and Namibia have joined hands, not to beg, but to build, to turn the minerals beneath their soil into power for their people. They are calling it a strategic mineral alliance, a partnership built on trust, not control. Their goal? To refine their uranium and rare earth metals right at home, to make sure the world finally pays a fair price for Africa's resources. This pact has set off alarms in Western capitals, because these two countries hold the key to the future of energy and technology. Uranium fuels the world's reactors. Rare earths run every smartphone, satellite, and electric vehicle. Without them, modern life stops. For years, Western companies dictated the market. They exported raw or paid pennies and owned the patents. But now, Zimbabwe and Namibia are rewriting the rules. They're saying, no more raw exports, only refined value. And that changes everything. This is not just an economic decision. It's a political earthquake. A message to the world that Africa is ready to control its destiny, to turn natural wealth into national strength. The question shaking global markets is simple. If Africa keeps its resources, who will power the West? In early 2025, Zimbabwe and Namibia finalized a memorandum that few believed possible. It called for joint exploration, processing, and marketing of strategic minerals, uranium, lithium, cobalt, and rare earth elements. At first, the world barely noticed. But inside Africa, the signal was clear. A quiet revolution had begun. For more than a century, these two nations supplied raw materials to power other continents. Namibia's uranium-fed reactors in Europe and Asia. Zimbabwe's lithium and gold-built industries in America and China. Yet both nations struggled with debt, inflation, and unemployment. Leaders looked at the numbers, and they saw a paradox. Trillions in mineral value underground, but millions of citizens living without electricity. Something had to change. In 2023, Zimbabwe banned the export of raw lithium. Soon after, Namibia restricted unprocessed critical mineral exports. These bold moves drew criticism from Western investors and applause from across Africa. The new alliance was the logical next step. Instead of competing for buyers, Zimbabwe and Namibia would co-invest in local refineries and share infrastructure for smelting, transport, and research. Experts estimate this cooperation could generate over $10 billion a year in regional trade within the next decade. But beyond the numbers lies something bigger: dignity. For the first time, the profits, jobs, and technology would stay in African hands. Unlike previous deals with Western multinationals, this pact gives equal control to both nations. Namibia's experience in uranium extraction meets Zimbabwe's growing refining capacity. Together, they can supply fuel for Africa's own power plants and export high-value processed materials abroad. International observers were quick to connect the dots. With these two countries cooperating, Africa could control nearly 15% of the world's uranium output and a significant share of lithium and rare earth reserves. That's enough to shift bargaining power in global energy markets. Financial analysts in London and Washington began issuing warnings. If African countries follow this model, Western tech companies could face higher costs and tighter supplies. Stockholders in battery and nuclear industries took notice. But inside Africa, the story was different. In markets and radio stations from Lagos to Lusaka, people spoke with pride. For once, headlines weren't about conflict or crisis. They were about control and cooperation. The alliance between Zimbabwe and Namibia inspired talk of a wider African energy bloc. Ministers from Malawi, Tanzania, and the Democratic Republic of Congo signaled interest. They discussed shared refining centers, cross-border rail links, and continental pricing standards. If realized, this could become Africa's answer to OPEC, not for oil, but for the minerals of the future. President Mnangagwa of Zimbabwe summarized it best. We will no longer ship poverty abroad and import wealth back. Namibia's government echoed the sentiment. Our resources will fuel Africa first. Those two statements traveled faster than any press release. They became a rallying cry, echoed in speeches, hashtags, and street murals. This movement isn't anti-West. It's pro-Africa. It's about fairness, balance, and independence. In a global economy racing toward renewable energy, control over critical minerals means power. And for the first time, that power is shifting south. As one Namibian commentator put it, they once called it the third world. Now it's the first source. For more than a century, Africa was treated like the engine room of the world, powering industries abroad while running on fumes at home. Gold, copper, oil, diamonds, cobalt. Each resource flowed out of the continent in raw form. Factories, refineries, and profits stayed overseas. Every time Africa dug deeper, someone else grew richer. But that old system is cracking. A new generation of African leaders has learned the numbers, studied the contracts, and seen the imbalance. They now ask one question. If we own the minerals, why don't we own the wealth? In the boardrooms of Washington and Brussels, that question sounds like thunder. Because the answer reveals a truth the world tried to ignore. Africa no longer needs permission to prosper. It began quietly. Countries like Zambia, Tanzania, and Ghana passed laws requiring local processing of minerals. Zimbabwe and Namibia took it further, banning raw exports outright. Suddenly, the old business model stopped working. Companies that once shipped or to Europe now face new rules. They must invest locally, train African engineers, and share profits fairly. Some left in frustration. Others stayed, realizing the future would be built with Africa, not on Africa. For the West, the change was a shockwave. European battery makers began warning about shortages of lithium and cobalt. Tech companies in Silicon Valley faced rising prices for essential metals. Reports surfaced of stockpiles shrinking and new projects being delayed. Meanwhile, African governments launched industrial zones near mining sites. They built refineries, laboratories, and solar plants powered by their own resources. The money that once flowed out is starting to circulate within. It funds schools, clinics, and infrastructure. Ordinary people are beginning to see what local value really means. As Western investors hesitated, new partners arrived. India, China, the UAE, and even Indonesia began offering joint ventures instead of extraction contracts. They promised technology transfer, scholarships, and processing facilities. This was the real loss of control, not a coup or a protest, but a quiet rewrite of the global playbook. Africa no longer sells what it digs, it sells what it makes. And that single change has redrawn the world map of power. When Europe tried to cut its dependence on Asian rare earths, it looked to Africa again. But now, African nations negotiate as equals. They talk about fair pricing, environmental safeguards, and revenue sharing. The old deals, signed behind closed doors, are being replaced with transparent, sovereign agreements. The continent that once exported raw materials now exports policy models. In financial circles, analysts call it the African value revolution. On the ground, people call it justice. At the center of this shift is human capital. Thousands of African students are studying engineering, geology, and renewable energy. Universities partner with international labs to build homegrown expertise. When you visit Bulawayo or Windhoek today, you see startups designing battery components and solar panels. They're small now, but they represent something huge: ownership of the future. Every refinery, every research center, every trade school breaks one more link in the old chain of dependence. In Western media, you hear phrases like resource nationalism or strategic risk. In Africa, it's called sovereignty. These nations aren't closing their doors, they're opening new ones on their own terms. They welcome fair partners, but reject exploitation. They invite investment, but demand respect. That's the real revolution. The courage to say no until the deal makes sense. When Namibia or Zimbabwe announces a new refinery, it does more than produce metal. It produces confidence. Other nations take note and follow. Suddenly, Western corporations realize they must compete not just for contracts, but for trust. Diplomats visit more often. Agreements become more balanced. Africa's leverage has grown. It's no longer the world's supplier. It's the world's partner. Behind every ton of refined lithium or processed uranium is a community that gains stability. Families earning steady wages. Young people finding pride in skilled work instead of raw extraction. Villages with electricity, clinics with equipment, schools with computers, all powered by local industry. These are the stories that rarely make the headlines, but they define the continent's real rise. Now the West faces a crossroads. Adapt to a new, balanced partnership, or risk being left behind. For once, Africa isn't asking for aid. It's offering opportunity, an invitation to collaborate on clean energy, innovation, and sustainable growth. The old imbalance is being corrected not by confrontation, but by creation. When news of Africa's mineral alliances reached the world's capitals, the reaction was instant. Stock markets wobbled. Energy analysts scrambled for data. And in private, Western officials asked one question. Did we just lose control of the 21st century as supply chain? Because the numbers spoke loudly. Africa holds over 30% of the world's mineral wealth: lithium, cobalt, uranium, platinum, gold, and the rare earth metals that power every modern device. For decades, those minerals left the continent unprocessed. Now, the flow is changing direction. In Europe, headlines began warning of an African resource realignment. Automakers feared shortages of battery metals. Tech firms in California faced rising prices for components once taken for granted. Even defense industries, dependent on rare earths, felt the squeeze. In short, a supply chain storm was forming, and it had an African origin. But on the continent itself, the mood was the opposite. Optimism, energy, pride. From Accra to Addis Ababa, newspapers ran stories celebrating the new independence and trade. Television talk shows discussed how Africa could finally dictate its own economic rhythm. Social media lit up with one phrase: Africa rising for real. Unity had long been Africa's greatest dream and its hardest challenge. Borders drawn by history often divided nations with shared resources. Now, minerals are doing what politics could not, bringing countries together. Regional economic blocs are expanding. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, is becoming a living reality. Goods, ideas, and technology are crossing frontiers faster than ever. Zimbabwe and Namibia's pact inspired others. Botswana and South Africa began talking about shared diamond value chains. Kenya and Ethiopia explored joint agricultural exports. West African states studied common refining hubs for gold and bauxite. Piece by piece, the puzzle of African unity is taking shape, built not on speeches, but on shared interest. In Washington, policy experts published long reports urging strategic engagement with Africa. In Brussels, the European Union announced new investment programs: green energy, digital infrastructure, critical minerals. In Beijing and New Delhi, officials strengthened existing partnerships, offering technology, not lectures. The world had realized something profound. If you want to grow in the next century, you must work with Africa. For the first time, Africa's presence at global summits commands attention, not sympathy. No longer a developing region, but a decisive player in food security, clean energy, and innovation. The new generation of Africans see the continent differently. They wear African brands. They build apps in African languages. They celebrate local heroes, scientists, engineers, farmers, artists. The sense of identity runs deep. Our destiny, our design. African universities form networks for mineral research. Women lead cooperatives in mining communities. Young entrepreneurs develop sustainable extraction methods that respect the land. The transformation is not just economic, it's cultural. It's a statement of confidence that Africa can lead ethically, sustainably, and proudly. Across Europe, the Americas, and the Caribbean, the African diaspora feels the shift. They see a continent no longer described by crisis, but by capability. Investment groups form. Remittances flow into startups, not just family aid. Artists, filmmakers, and influencers tell stories of innovation instead of dependency. Every viral video, every news headline about Africa's rise feeds the same emotion: belonging. From London to Lagos, from Atlanta to Accra, the diaspora is connecting dots. They realize their identity and opportunity are tied to the same continent that once powered the world's industries. As alliances multiply, African ministers talk about forming a critical minerals forum, a council to coordinate prices, production, and sustainability. It's not about isolation, it's about negotiation. Fair terms. Equal seats at the table. This is what the world sees now. Not a continent waiting for rescue, but a network of nations designing the future. The phrase "made in Africa" is slowly replacing "mined from Africa." That shift carries power, prestige, and purpose. For years, the world looked at Africa and saw only potential. Now it must look again and see reality. The reality of ports expanding, roads connecting, satellites launching, and policies maturing. Yes, there are challenges: corruption, instability, external pressure. But the momentum of change is stronger than fear. When African leaders meet today, they talk not about aid, but about value. Not about charity, but about strategy. Not about catching up, but about leading forward. And the world listens. This chapter of Africa's story is more than economics. It's emotional redemption. It's the collective heartbeat of a continent rising after centuries of extraction. When a child in Harare sees a refinery built by local engineers. When a young coder in Windhoek designs software to track mineral logistics. When a farmer in Mali sells produce across borders through digital trade. That's when you realize Africa's unity is not a slogan. It's alive. And that living unity is what truly terrifies the old order, because it means Africa has finally found its rhythm. The world has changed. And whether the West accepts it or not, Africa is no longer a silent participant. It is the heartbeat of the new global order. From the cobalt fields of Congo to the lithium valleys of Zimbabwe, from Nigeria's oil corridors to Namibia's green hydrogen future, a wave of sovereignty has risen that no nation can suppress. For centuries, Africa's story was told by others. Its resources taken, its people silenced, its potential buried under systems designed to keep it divided and dependent. But today, the silence has broken. The world's largest reserves of minerals, energy, and youth are now rewriting the script. This is not just economics. It's justice. It's restoration. It's the rebirth of a continent that has always had the power, now backed by unity, vision, and courage. The West calls it a crisis, but Africans call it liberation. Because for the first time, African leaders are not begging for inclusion. They are building their own alliances, setting their own prices, and defending their own interests. They're saying to the world, if you want our resources, you'll respect our people. That message echoes from Dakar to Dar es Salaam. It vibrates in the streets of Accra, Lusaka, and Kigali. It fuels every young African innovator who dreams not of escape, but of building at home. And the world is watching. Nervous, uncertain, but slowly accepting the truth. Africa is no longer a chapter in someone else's book. Africa is the author now. As the sun rises over the continent, it does not rise on desperation, it rises on determination. It shines on nations that finally understand the value of their land, their labor, and their legacy. And so, this is the new African century. A century where cobalt replaces oil, knowledge replaces dependency, and unity replaces division. A century where the global economy depends not on Western vaults, but on African vision. The West may panic. Markets may shake, but Africa will not bow again. Because this time, the power isn't in their boardrooms. It's in our soil, our cities, our people. And that power, that unstoppable African spirit, is what will define the future. This is Africa's moment. The moment our ancestors dreamed of. The moment our heroes died for. And the moment our generation will live to fulfill.
Welcome to African Spotlight 24, your premier source for news and current affairs from across the continent. We're glad you're here. If you're new to our channel, please subscribe, like, and turn on notification to stay up to date with the latest news and analysis. Your support helps us reach more people. Disclaimer: the content of this video is based on credible, publicly available information and is intended for educational, analytical, and informational purposes only. African Spotlight 24 does not promote hate, violence, misinformation, or political unrest. Our goal is to deliver thoughtful insights, highlight local voices, and encourage informed conversations throughout Africa.